scripture reading today comes from Colossians 3:12 through 17. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience. Bear with one another, and if anyone has a complaint against another, forgive each other, just as the Lord has forgiven you. So you also must forgive. Above all, clothe yourselves with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. And let the peace of Christ rule in all wisdom and with gratitude in your hearts, sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs to God. And whatever you do, in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him. May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and living of this holy word this day. Thanks be to God.
Maybe some of you have had the experience of hearing these words. I can't believe somebody let them out of the house looking like that. Or maybe you heard these words. What are you wearing? I could hear my mother. I think if we were honest, we would have to admit that we judge people by their outward appearance. And we all have had that experience of wanting to dress and make a statement. Maybe that happened to you at a young age. Maybe it's still something you like to do. But we like to dress and make our opinions known in many ways. You wear your favorite sports teams on a jersey, and you wear mission trip t-shirts and vacation Bible school t-shirts and special causes t-shirts and your favorite celebrity shirts and vacation spots that you visited. We all like to remind folks of the things that we're passionate about. We also like to wear things that talk sometimes and reveal things about our faith. We wear crosses and collars and yarmulkes and turbans and robes and all sorts of things that provide an insight perhaps into our faith. We even know that some people's work is revealed to us by what they wear, the uniforms that they have. We easily recognize firemen and policemen and postal workers just because of what they wear. When the earliest Christians were baptized, they were told to strip off their clothes before entering into the baptismal waters. And then they were given new clothes for their new life. Now, these new clothes that they received weren't anything special, but the whole act was done to signify an entirely new way of being and relating to others after baptism. And so when they stepped out of the water and put on these new clothes, they were making a covenant to be clothed in the virtues of Christ. The scripture that was shared again this morning is written by Paul, or was written by Paul to the church in Colossae. And he's writing this from prison. Paul has heard from someone who's traveled to where he is that there's problems in the church, and there's arguments and disagreements about what's happening, and there's even rumors of false teachings happening there. A church in disagreement. Who knew? So Paul is writing to the church members there, and he's reminding them about what they've been previously taught, and reminding them also about their baptisms. He's reminding them that as followers of Jesus Christ, they now have a different way of living, they have a different way of treating people, and so to take the metaphor along with that, they have a new set of clothes to wear. They're supposed to, as Paul said in the letter, to clothe themselves with compassion and kindness and humility and meekness and patience. He's essentially reminding them that the path that they've chosen to take is a difficult one at best. And he's reminding them that because of these promises that they made at baptism, they are also being challenged to be loving and forgiving. You might say Paul wants these Christians to dress for success. So as we listen again this morning to Paul's ethical wardrobe reminders, we might think to ourselves, how could putting on these new clothes, or we know we're talking about new behaviors, how could doing this make a difference? So I want us to look at these and see how this might work. These items of clothing, that's clothing ourselves with these things, as Paul says, these behaviors, we have to remember were not safe behaviors at the time that Paul is talking to these folks. Because these behaviors would have made them different. And it probably would have gotten them some perhaps unwanted attention. Attention that they might not want, because it might mean that they would be targeted by the Romans. These clothes or these behaviors that Paul is talking about also could be seen as signs of weakness, because, if you're kind and loving and meek and humble, that doesn't mean that you're necessarily very forthright or very strong, at least in some people's eyes. These clothes of compassion and kindness could certainly get them in trouble and perhaps even killed. And so when we look at these statements that Paul makes to these people at the church in Colossae, we need to remember that this is really heavy stuff for the people at this time in their lives. But what's more important, I think, is that we look at these words and ask ourselves these questions about what are we wearing. As I said read in the prayer meditation, we're living in a world that seems to prefer to dress up in anger and slander and abusive language. And for some, that's an alluring set of clothing to wear. Maybe it's because they feel comfortable in it, or the behaviors in clothing feel comfortable and familiar. They're so easy to slip on because you blend in so well with the rest of the crowd. And remember, you used to say, well, everyone else is doing it. But what happens when we slip back into those old customs, those old behaviors? What we do as we profess to be Christians is that we just live into the stereotypes that other people have of who Christians really are. We are the ones that are supposed to be wearing something other than intolerance and anger and hatred. And so Paul's reminder to the Colossians is a reminder for us today. So we have to ask ourselves, are we clothing ourselves with compassion? Now the word compassion literally translates into bowels of sympathy. The ancients believed that the emotions originated in the bowels, down there in your stomach. That's where your emotions came from. And so we we don't talk about it that way anymore. We talk about love, our hearts being the place where emotions come from. But we still hearken back to that idea of what compassion means. Maybe you've said at some point in time you have a gut feeling. It's that sense that you have. It sometimes is just right there. And that's where the sense and compassion come from. Compassion calls us to a sense of sympathy or empathy with someone. So I think that perhaps Paul mentions compassion first in the list of clothing that we should be putting on first, because that's the first thing that we should put on when we start our day. So if we're going to take compassion or empathy or sympathy one step further, we continue by putting on, Paul says, kindness. So kindness then becomes an action because of compassion and reveals our compassion. Kindness can take different forms. It can be as simple as a smile or a kind word, a pat on the back for a job well done, an invitation to lunch, an offer to help. Kindness isn't necessarily a big thing, but it's an important thing. And then Paul says we're to clothe ourselves with humility. Now, this is an important quality. And this is probably a tough one, because it's to be careful about our pride. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't take pride in things that we do well and who we are as people, but when we are humble, we think humbly of ourselves as not to put ourselves and make ourselves superior to others. That's when our humbleness comes to show. And then Paul says we're supposed to put on meekness. Now, meekness has at first glance a connotation of being weak. But meekness really doesn't mean that. Meekness is actually described as strength under control. So you don't have to reveal true strength to show that you have a sense of gentleness or meekness. And then Paul says, I want you to put on patience. Literally, patience means long suffering. We're not good at that. That means that we're going to endure another's exasperating conduct without flying off the handle. Another tough thing to do. It's talking about long suffering means that we find out a way to restrain ourselves from becoming upset or speaking harshly to someone, especially if we find their conduct difficult or exasperating. Which links us to the next thing that Paul says we need to put on, and that's forbearance. That literally means bear with one another. We say that a lot, though, don't we? Bear with me. We're essentially saying, have patience with me. But literally, forbearance means to uphold and support someone. So if we're offering forbearance, it means that we're holding someone up. That we're not putting ourselves ahead of one another, but that we're instead encouraging another person. We're forbearing with them. We're holding them up and supporting them. And then Paul says, again, and this is a tough one, that you need to put on forgiveness. Now, I've preached sermon series on forgiveness. It takes a long time to talk about forgiveness. But forgiveness means that we don't hold grudges against persons who have offended us in some way. And Paul says the reason that you do this is because God has forgiven you first. Now, being forgiving doesn't mean that you don't air your grievances. Certainly we're supposed to do that. You need to talk about how you feel, and even with the person whom you feel has offended you. You don't have to repress your feelings, and you don't have to put up with injustice or unfairness. Those things need to be talked out and dealt with. But after having said how you feel, after having done that, then you need to forgive and put it away. Now again, it doesn't mean that you've forgotten about it, but you put it aside. And forgiveness means that you're not going to bring it up to the person that you have forgiven over and over again. You don't drag it out like they say, like an archaeological dig. Every time you want to put something back in someone's face when you disagree with them. Well, remember that time I forgave you. You don't do that. Forgiveness also means that you don't tell someone else about what you forgave of someone else. You're not supposed to gossip or brag about how forgiving you've been. Another thing that forgiveness means is that we don't remind ourselves about what has been forgiven. This means that we don't let that thing that we've forgiven in someone color our attitude toward them. If we've truly forgiven, then we need to look at them as a brother or sister once again. Forgiving means that you put aside that thing that has offended you from others and even from yourself. Forgiveness, I think, is the hardest part of the things that Paul is reminding the Colossians that they need to do. So the question then becomes, why do we do this? Why do we put on these things, these attitudes? And Paul tells us right there, and it's read in verse 12, because God has chosen you, he says. The reason you do these things is because you have been chosen by God. Chosen through Christ to be different. To not be of the world. To be loving and kind and caring and forgiving and compassionate and all of those things. Because as followers of Jesus Christ, you are intended to be different. To live differently, to talk differently, to act differently. So how can we do this? We can do this because, as Paul says, we're dearly loved by God. So the last part of the scripture is I look at it as kind of a blessing, maybe an admonition, a reminder of everything that's just been said. And Paul says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you are called to peace. And be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly as you teach and counsel one another with all wisdom, and as you sing psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs with gratitude in your hearts to God. What a picture, a beautiful picture of what a church is supposed to be and do. What would it be like if all of our folks in churches could act in this way? Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. Actually, the word rule that's translated here actually literally translates into act as an umpire. So it could say, let the peace of Christ act as an umpire in your hearts. Think about that. So let the peace of Christ act as an umpire in your hearts and be thankful. You know, that old saying, we should be having an attitude of gratitude. And we do this. We're grateful because we know that nothing we have, nothing we have is what we deserve. It's only given to us by God's grace because of God's love for us. And then the last part is important too, I think, because it says, remember to offer praise, sing hymns and spiritual songs. Just another way of saying that this music is our souls singing God's praise. It's music that lets us lift our voices and spirits and reminds us of God's goodness and greatness. And so perhaps for all of us, it's time to take a look at our spiritual wardrobe and ask ourselves, what have we been putting on? Do people know you are a follower of Christ by your patience, your love, your forgiveness, your compassion, your joy, and your thanksgiving? Or do they have to ask, what are you wearing?